What's up guys? So in today's video, I'm going to talk about how to buy a used outboard motor. So over the years, I've purchased hundreds of outboard motors. I fix them up and sell them. So I just want to share some of my knowledge and some tips and tricks on how to buy a used outboard motor. So this video is going to be mostly geared toward beginner boaters and in the smaller horsepower outboards, since that's what I mostly do. But there's definitely useful applications for bigger boats. So when it comes to the mechanical side of outboard motors, you're going to have two kinds. You have your two-stroke motors and your four-stroke motors. So here's an example. Here's an older Johnson 1980s 15 horsepower two-stroke, and we have here a Nissan 15 horsepower four-stroke early 2000s model. And so I'm not going to dive into the mechanics of each of the two-stroke versus four-stroke, but in a nutshell, two-stroke motors are going to burn oil while four-stroke motors do not. When it comes to two-stroke motors like this Johnson here, they're going to be less fuel efficient because they're burning oil. They're also going to smoke a lot more. They're going to leach a little bit of oil into the water, and they're gonna be a lot louder than your four-stroke motors. That doesn't mean they're a bad motor. Personally, I really like two-strokes. They're a lot easier to work on. They're a lot lighter than your four-strokes, so that's just something to consider, the difference between a two-stroke and four-stroke. When it comes to fuel economy, in these smaller horsepower motors, like under 25 horsepower, you're not gonna notice too much of a difference in two-stroke versus four-stroke fuel economy, but as you jump up horsepower, you're definitely going to notice significant difference in fuel economy, with your modern four-strokes being way more fuel efficient than your older two-strokes. When it comes to two-stroke motors, there's two ways that oil can get added to your tank. One being premix, or two being oil injected. So here's an example of having a premix tank. And so the oil, your two-stroke oil, gets directly added and mixed into your tank. And so there's certain ratios for every motor. A pretty common one is 50-1. And having a two-stroke mixing bottle is pretty helpful as well. You just fill up your oil to the line and then add it to the tank for how many gallons of fuel you have. So let's talk about the differences under the hood between this two-stroke versus four-stroke. So starting with this four-stroke, it's gonna have a built-in oil reservoir here where oil goes in. On the side here, you have a dipstick for checking the oil. And this model is carbureted. Some of the newer models have fuel injectors instead of a carburetor. So again, just being more fuel efficient. You're gonna have an oil filter on the side here. And because it has a built-in oil reservoir, this is gonna be a lot heavier since it's not burning oil like a two-stroke. So coming to this Johnson two-stroke here, a lot less electronics since it is an older motor, no oil reservoir, still carbureted, but this motor is a lot lighter. It's almost like 40 or 50 pounds lighter than this Nissan 15 horsepower. Talk about the age of outboard motors when it comes to two-strokes versus four-strokes. So kind of around the late 2000s to early 2010s, most of the major outboard makers stopped making two-stroke motors and switched to primarily just making four-stroke motors, just due to environmental regulations and updated air quality emissions. So if you're gonna buy a two-stroke motor, typically it's gonna be like at a minimum 15 years old. So when it comes to age of outboard motors again, let's factor in how that affects the components on each motor. So for instance, this is a 20-year-old Nissan four-stroke. And this is a 40-year-old two-stroke Johnson. Two-stroke motors do run a lot hotter than four-strokes. And so you just gotta factor in that the metal is 40 years old. All these plastic components are all original, and these are 40 years old as well. And so stuff's gonna break. All right, so you've narrowed down a few outboard motors you wanna go check out. Something to consider is how hard it is to find parts for these motors, especially some of the older ones. There's sometimes aftermarket parts out there, but original parts may be hard to come by. So I would check out parts that are gonna fail most likely, such as your carburetor, see if there's carb kits for that motor, fuel pumps, electronics, CDI, ignition, even impellers, propellers, all that kind of stuff is something you should look at to see how hard it is if there's parts available for your motor, because it's gonna fail eventually. Another thing to consider too is, was this motor used in salt water? I live 2 hours from the coast, but a lot of people still go to the coast and sometimes they don't properly flush their motors, which will make them die faster. While inspecting a motor, if you see rust or metal corroding, that's probably a clear indicator that a motor was used in salt water. Let's talk about price difference when it comes to two-stroke versus four-strokes. Two-strokes are older technology, typically going to be a lot cheaper than your modern four-strokes. Here in California, there's certain lakes that you can't have two-stroke motors on. So just with four-strokes being more fuel efficient, you can take them to all lakes. They're gonna have a higher value than your two-stroke motors. All right, so you scoured the internet for weeks and you finally found a sweet deal on an outboard motor. So you're gonna go check it out. So the first thing I would do is, one, invest in a compression gauge. and buy a good compression gauge. Like, don't buy the crappy Harbor Freight or Chinese ones off Amazon because they're not gonna have accurate readings. I mean, you can buy a good compression gauge for around like 30 bucks or so. So just spend a little bit of money to get a compression gauge. So a motor needs 3 things to run: compression, spark, and fuel, with compression being the most important. So a motor needs good compression for combustion to occur. So if a motor doesn't have good compression or low compression, it's basically just a parts motor and can't be saved without a complete rebuild. So some reasons that a motor could have low compression could be it was overheated, run without oil, maybe they just never changed the impeller, heavy saltwater use, or even just old age, or like some reasons why a motor could have low compression. But ensuring that a motor has good compression is really step number 1 before buying a used running or non-running outboard. All right, so to test compression on an outboard, you're gonna remove the spark plugs. So this is a 2-cylinder, so there's 2 spark plug holes, and you're just gonna put your compression gauge into the hole and twist it on. All right, I got the compression gauge on the top cylinder here. And before buying a motor, you should look up the specs, what your compression is supposed to be for that motor. So you're just gonna wanna pull over your motor about 5 or 10 times to get a PSI reading. All right, so this top cylinder is reading about 110, 115. So we'll check the bottom, and it should be within about 5 to 10% of that range for it to be a good running motor. Bottom one is also about 115 PSI, so that's good. We have even compression on this motor. So if you're buying a non-running outboard motor, I would definitely check the 2 things, compression and spark. So when it comes to spark, I just have a spark plug grounded here onto the block. Just make sure it's touching something metal, and then pull over the motor, and you should see a spark right here. If a motor doesn't have spark, there's a number of electronics that could potentially fail, so just ensuring that a motor has spark before buying it can save you a lot of time in the long run. Okay, I'm gonna pull over the motor. We have the spark plug grounded. We should see some spark. Alright, so when it comes to buying a non-running outboard motor, so you've narrowed down it's got compression, it's got spark. So lastly, it's just an issue with fuel. So for example, with this motor, when it comes to fuel issues, it's most likely the carb needs to be cleaned, but it could also be the fuel pump, it could be fuel filter, bad fuel in the fuel system. It could be your tank is not vented for your fuel tank. It could be a number of issues, but typically it's the carb. So just be prepared if you're buying a non-running outboard. It's most likely going to need a carb clean. Buying a running outboard motor, obviously you'd want to test it on the water if you can, but that's not likely the case. So at least at a minimum, hear it running on some earmuffs or like in a bucket of water. But when you're buying bigger horsepower outboard motors, like let's say you're buying a V6 150, especially if it's a 2-stroke, that motor can run, not on all of its cylinders and still sound okay. So having a compression gauge, even for running outboard motors, is crucial to make sure that you're not buying a ticking time bomb motor. All right, let's dive into transom length and transom rating and how that affects choosing the right outboard motor. So for this example, we have my aluminum boat. So typically aluminum boats in like the 10 to 14 foot range are most likely going to have a 15-inch transom, and that requires a short shaft motor. So by short shaft motor, it starts around 15 inches is what's categorized as a short shaft motor, and it goes up in increments of 5 inches, with the 20-inch or larger being a long shaft, and then 25-inch or larger being an extra long shaft, and so on. So for the right mounting height for your outboard motor, you want this anti-ventilation plate to line up with the lowest point of your boat, which in my case, I have an aluminum keel right here. So just for reference, I have this tape measure that lines up, and it basically touches the lowest point of this aluminum keel perfectly. So this is the right height for this outboard motor. Talk about transom horsepower and weight rating when it comes to boats. So for this boat, for instance, is an aluminum boat, and typically they have the horsepower rating on the transom of the boat. Mine's pretty faded, but you can see that this boat takes up to a 20 horsepower. For the bigger boats, it's usually around the helm or console area will tell you the horsepower rating. So something to consider too is the age of your boat. So this boat in particular is a 1979, and in 1979 they only had 2-stroke motors. I mean, I guess Honda was making some smaller 4-stroke motors, but primarily all the motors were 2-stroke, which are a lot lighter than today's 4-stroke motors. So for this example, you can see this is a 15 horsepower 4-stroke Nissan early 2000s, and it's significantly bigger than this 1980s Johnson 15 horsepower. So the weight of this is probably around the weight of like a 20 to even like up to 30 horsepower two-stroke, especially since this has electric start. So that's just something to consider when mounting on an older boat, the weight rating compared to a 4-stroke motor. So let's say you don't have a compression gauge, or the seller doesn't feel comfortable with you doing compression tests and testing the motor. What other things can you do? So one thing I like to do is testing all the gears and how it relates to the propeller. So it's in neutral right now, and in neutral your propeller should spin very freely, which it does. And then putting it in reverse and forward, the prop should lock into gear, so it's in forward. So now it should be locked. You can hear it clicking, it's locked. And then same thing for reverse as well. That should lock the gears, showing that all 3 gears are working. So there's a lot of little things you can check before buying an outboard to determine the condition of it. So for instance, this is a 4-stroke, so it has oil. So it's gonna most likely have a dipstick where you can check the condition of the oil to make sure it's at the right line and the color of the oil to determine if the oil's been changed recently. As far as carburetors, you know, a lot of times the outside is somewhat a clear indicator if it's dirty on the inside, but that's not always the case, but you can check that. You know, if you see any rust on any of the bolts or metal, that probably means it was used in salt water. So that's one thing to consider. You know, checking the condition of the spark plugs, if they're fouled up, determine how old they are. You know, same thing with the oil filter, determining how old it looks. I typically like to write the date it was changed just for reference, but not everyone does that. You can also look at the fuel filter and see how dirty that is to determine if there's a lot of gunk in there and if the fuel that was in it is bad if it's been sitting. I like to test the throttle position, so I have it in forward, and just to make sure that everything's moving as it should. A non-running motor, you know, even running, you probably want to pull the pull string to make sure that there's no nicks in it, and that it should be hard to pull over to confirm that it has compression, especially if it's non-running motor. When it comes to the lower unit, if you really wanted to, you could undo this bottom screw just enough until some oil comes out to determine if it's milky or if it's good oil. If it's milky, that means water was getting into the lower unit. You probably have a bad seal somewhere. The thing to check before buying an outboard motor is the anode. You know, I'm not going to dive into the science behind it, but every outboard motor should have an anode as a sacrificial metal, so electrolysis doesn't eat away the metal of your motor. So here's an example. It's typically found around your lower unit of an anode. So this one's decent, but you can already see that the metal is starting to get eaten away. So once this gets all eaten away, then it would start eating the metal of my motor. All right, so let's talk about a few things you can do when you're gonna go fire up a motor you're looking to buy. So we're just gonna use this Johnson 9.9 horsepower 2-stroke as an example here. And so obviously if you can fire it up and run it on a body of water on a boat, that would be the best way to buy it, but that's typically not the case buying used outboard motors. So really your 2 options are gonna be using some earmuffs hooked up to a hose, or using a bin of water. So using earmuffs is okay to use. You know, you just hook it up to your water intake vents here. But if you have the choice, I would definitely use a bin of water. You know, having a bin of water, that puts the motor under load, and that's gonna simulate better how the motor is gonna act on a boat, on a body of water. So having a motor and a bin of water is gonna put more force and water pressure on your motor. And so for instance, this motor, for example, it had a weak impeller, and so it would run with the earmuffs, but it would not run in a bin of water because the force of the water on the lower unit, the impeller was too weak to actually pump water. So again, having the bin of water, having your motor under load, it's gonna idle a little bit less as opposed to the earmuffs, because having the motor under load is gonna cause it to use more gas, and so it's gonna actually idle a little bit higher with the earmuffs than it would in a bin of water. And when you're giving it forward and giving it throttle, it's going to be using that much more fuel in a bin of water, better simulating how your motor will actually run on the water. And so there is the potential with earmuffs that it may not run as well as it would in a bin of water. So something you can check too that I like, when you give your motor full throttle, I can't really get my GoPro in there to show, but here's just a carb for example. At full throttle, you want to make sure that that butterfly is perfectly horizontal, and that it's getting the maximum amount of fuel that it needs. So when you go to fire up your motor, I would personally like to bring my own fuel tank just to know that it's clean fuel to fire it up. There's a few things you can check to see if you have any leaks. One being the fuel connector, or if the person you're buying for has one. Sometimes the O-rings can go bad, can be leaking fuel. You know, the fuel pump here too, if you see any leaks, it might be a bad gasket or diaphragm. And then even at the carburetor, you see it leaking out the side here, you may have a sticking float or bad needle, or even if it's leaking around this area, maybe some bad gaskets. But just some things to look for even when you're just pumping up the primer bulb. So if you have the option, I would definitely fire it up cold. You know, you never know if the previous owner had already like pulled it over 20 times or given it starter fluid. So I'd personally like to see how it starts cold. All right, I'm gonna pull over this motor that's been sitting, so it's gonna be a cold start. Yeah, something to note too, every motor is a little bit different. You know, typically pull out the choke, pull it over, push it back in. You know, every motor is a little different. Sometimes it needs a little bit of throttle to get going and pull it over. So just make note, that's why it's better to start it cold, just to see how it wants to run. All right, primer bulb's hard. Give it a little choke. No throttle. Push the choke back in. Choke it. So once it's running, I want to listen to hear how the motor sounds. So it's idling a little bit high, which is okay. Another thing too is check how the water stream is. I just changed the color on this, so it's pumping the maximum amount of water. But these keyholes can also get clogged as well. So if it's not peeing good water, you could try shoving like a zip tie or a wire up there to see if there's any blockage. That's pretty typical for motors that have been sitting. So once it's running, I just want to walk around the motor and see if I can see anything out of the ordinary. Again, if it's leaking fuel, that's an issue. It's not leaking any fuel from the fuel pump, which is good. So if the air mixture too is out of adjustment, you might hear some variation in the RPMs, like maybe it's revving a little high then low, high and low, but it's not. It is idling kind of high. Let's give it some throttle. See if there's any hesitation on the throttle, which there is not. So we'll see if all the gears work. Moving forward. Back to neutral. Reverse. Back to neutral. Alright, I'm going to stop the fire. Just see if it wants to fire back up right away. It's a good idea to ask the seller as many questions as you can too, like how long has it been sitting, when the last time it was on the water, how old the fuel is, when the last time it was serviced, things like oil, impeller, all that kind of stuff add up to determine whether it's worth buying or not. So yeah, I hope all this information has helped you in picking out a used outboard motor. So thanks for watching all this, and see you guys next time.